Probably no other figure of the counterculture was so powerful than Jim Morrison. Morrison was the lead singer of The Doors, and he could invoke a crowd to any response he chose. So he became rather dangerous. And at the end of the 60s, you had three major figures of the rock counterculture. You had Jimi Hendrix, you had Janis Joplin, and you had Jim Morrison. Morrison had been put on trial in Miami, Florida for indecent exposure. While he was in court, he had read in a newspaper that Jimi Hendrix had died. 2 weeks later, Janis Joplin. Morrison turns to his friends and he says, "You know, you're drinking with number 3. After Morrison was found guilty, he was not sentenced, but a decision was made for Jim to go to Paris to work on a book of poetry. Now, that was what the Doors management said, but what they did know was that France would not extradite a sex crime case back to the United States. So Morrison would be relatively safe as long as he lived in Paris. One day, the phone rings a few days after Jim Morrison's death, which occurred on July 2nd, 1971. The message was taken by Ray Manzarek, and when Bill Siddons, the Doors manager, was sent to Paris, Ray Manzarek looks at him and he says, Bill, make sure. To make sure means to see the body, because Morrison had told the Doors that he could see himself dropping completely out of the music business, putting on a three-piece suit and going into business. So that thought puzzled Manzarek. When Bill Siddons got to France, all he found was a simple wood veneer coffin with the lid screwed into place. The coffin could not be opened. So technically, Pamela Courson had seen the body and the French coroner who wrote the report. Bill Siddons attended the funeral at Père Lachaise, and then he tells everyone that it was an unfortunate thing that Jim had died because rumors had always circulated about Jim Morrison dying in car accidents or drug overdoses, but now, sadly to say, the story was real. When the Morrison family found out, Morrison had already been buried, so the question was Jim Morrison dead, or did he fake his death in order to escape his rock celebrityism and the idea that, well, that maybe the government would be after him? Recently, a new book came out in France in which the writer claims that Jim Morrison was given an overdose in a Parisian nightclub. The two men who had given him the drug had picked him up, carried him back to his apartment, and put him in the bath. So in his version, Morrison had died at the nightclub. What was odd about how Morrison's body was found was he was found with his back toward the faucets, which would be very uncomfortable to sit there and have those faucets into your back. It also brings into question Pamela Courson's story about being home with Jim when he died. So a lot of these questions have been unanswered. There's even a story of a mysterious double whose name was Dietmar, who looked like Morrison. The idea was that maybe he had died, and maybe in death, Jim Morrison had his way to escape. And one of the more strange elements has to do with the size of the grave itself. Both Ray Manzarek and John Densmore have said, this grave is too small for Jim Morrison. The coffin is too small. He can't be buried there. So as long as there's doubt, the urban legend continues. One of the most interesting factors was that when Morrison died, Pamela Courson leased his grave at Père Lachaise. She did not purchase it. It was leased. It was leased for 30 years. So in 2001, on July 8th, the French government was pretty well determined to have Jim Morrison sent back to LA. The reason being the massive graffiti at Père Lachaise. If you've been to Père Lachaise, especially in the 80s and early 90s, you can identify Morrison's grave, which, by the way, is one of the top 10 visited sites in France, in Paris. You could walk into the cemetery, an arrow would point Jim, you followed that way. Another arrow would become Jim, where the eye is pointing straight ahead. And then the closer you got to his grave, the more Doors lyrics appeared on tombstones. For instance, Ride the King's Highway, Morrison's Hotel. Now, this story may have very well have broken and we would have known who was in the grave, but the French government allowed Jim Morrison to become a permanent resident of Père Lachaise when the Morrison family agreed to clear all graffiti from the cemetery to put a security system into the grave. But I will tell you, When you go to see Morrison's grave, you will find at least 2 policemen on duty. He's the only guarded grave in Paris. Now, if you think about Chopin being buried just a few hundred feet above his grave, it's rather interesting that you don't see graffiti that points Fred, only Jim. And Jim Morrison, and whatever secret is in his grave, will remain at Père Lachaise. This is Gary Patterson. Thanks for walking with me on the dark side. You know, you may think some of these stories are fact and some are fiction, but one thing for certain, you'll never listen to your music exactly the same way again.